Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. President Muhammadu Buhari has taken time to explain why he usually appears ponderous when deciding on or handling state matters. According to him, there is need to take as much time as possible in order to make the right decisions at all times. But this attitude has never gone down well with economists and development partners, who believe that given its many challenges, Nigeria should be a country in a hurry. For further discussion on this and why the president seems to be taking such a long time to make fresh appointments, we'll now be joined by Dr. Sam Amadi, a political economist and former chairman of the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission. Sam Amadi, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for coming to the morning show again. Now, you had my introduction. It's already, almost 2 weeks now since President Buhari was inaugurated for a second term in office. And we have not had anything. No appointments have been made. Some of his staff, whose tenure would seem to have also expired by the sheer fact of the efflution of time, are still there working for him. They've not been reappointed. What's the implication of this for the polity?
Well, first and foremost, I think the legality should be sorted out. Aides who would be reappointed should be reappointed quickly, because otherwise their actions, they're acting illegally. By now, all the aides are no longer out of employment, so to say. Of course, they could be working behind as personal staff in this case, but not as officers of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. So I think they should immediately be reauthorized through reappointment or kind of officially excused so that they can be with the president at home, do some things privately while awaiting appointment. That's the first point. So the issue of legality should be sorted out. It's really very, very sad to hear people mention Special Advisor on National Assembly to the President. There's no other advisor to the President, no Chief of Staff in this circumstance, no SGF at this point in time. We just have the President and the Vice President, and of course the usual complement of civil service, the permanent secretaries, the directors, and others whose appointments and service are tenured for the pension. Again, on the political economic side of it, well, we think that by now, perhaps key appointments like the Chief of Staff, Secretary of Government, appointments that don't require confirmation could be done. And in fact, some that require confirmation could be confirmed by the outgoing National Assembly before now, since Mr. President has resumed work, signing bills and doing other things. So he's structured in a way that the President outlives the National Assembly by a few days or weeks, as the case might be, or week, as the case might be. So there should be need by now to reappoint those key officers. But the point is, perhaps the president, all presidents have different temperament. We recall that Ronald Reagan was reputed to not to want to really think too much or read too much, and his wife was very, very notorious then of calling on aides, calling them out for keeping her husband late reading or prepping speeches. So that presidents who are very good with quick decision-making, the presidents who perhaps are much more laborious or dilly-dally, the critical thing would be, we think, that if and when the president makes decision, and they should be sooner than later, let those be decisions that are going to be positive. People will say, oh, Mr. President got that right. And what would be bad is to take time and then perhaps end with suboptimal appointments. So I think by now we are familiar with the president's style. But we would urge that it's important to kickstart government in a formal way. And I think key offices like the Chief of Staff, the AGF, and key aides, very important. Ministers can come perhaps in the next 1 or 2 weeks. Ideally, they should have probably be ready today so that by tomorrow when the National Assembly comes into, the new National Assembly begins, the list will be in. But that's ideal. So we would expect perhaps a few more horse trading, politicking around the list. But for now, it's important to have clarity about staffers who will shape the next policy or who will refine the existing policy. And so the inability or the not knowing whether these old staffers will be returned or not creates a sense of uncertainty in terms of what will be the policy projection of the government, because staffers create, if you can actually, denominate a government by looking at the nomenclature of the staffers. So you could see where they will be heading to if you do a profiling of those staffers. And that's why staffers are very critical. And although in our country we've been routine and do some primordial considerations, but essentially a president and his staffers define direction. And so since we don't have clarity as to who's going to stay on board and who's going to leave, it'll be very difficult to predict the policy direction or the changes that might happen to government, the EPG, the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan that perhaps continues in these next 4 years.
Now, Dr. Amadi, what's also interesting to note is that the president is going to be addressing about 91 world leaders and the Nigerian community in 2 days' time on our New Democracy Day to discuss his roadmap for the next 4 years. Yet we're still looking at a situation where we do not know the appointments for MDAs going into the next 4 years. Now, as Dr. Abati stated, a huge concern, of course, is the economic concern and implications of this. So let's discuss the short-term and the long-term economic implications. In the president's first administration, when he did take over, it took him 6 months, yet the economy was in a far better state than it is today. So let's start off with the short-term implications for the economy. What exactly are we experiencing that we should note, and what are we going to be experiencing that we need to take note of as Nigerian citizens?
That's a very important question. I think really when Clinton said it is economy stupid, I think it's the economy. Even if you look at the insecurity in the country, it has economic definition. Essentially, the fact that most of our citizens across the country, and particularly in the north, are very poor. They are unskilled. They're not properly educated or even educated, and therefore the crime becomes a natural attraction. And then the banditry, the kidnapping, and all the criminal activities across the country are more explained by economic factors, a sense of hopelessness, a sense of low human capital. Even the social capital to bear adversity, we don't have it. So the first thing is to look at what didn't work in the last 4 years. And some will say perhaps in the last 20 years of democracy. What has not worked is that poverty has not been drastically reduced or even attacked. Why? Because in the first wave of the PDP government, we focused a lot on, we grew the economy. We had the decade, called the golden decade, where the economy grew. But it was economic growth that was not really, that didn't so much as, kind of dent poverty. Why so? Because it was a neoliberal focused policy that's predicated on the fact that somehow if the economy grows, if few people become millionaires, if you have more company startups, somehow there's going to be a trickle down to those who are trapped bottom. Now, all over the world, in Europe, in America, recently Stiglitz came out with an article in the Prospect and argued strongly on what he called progressive capitalism, which is the idea that you now have to look at the market as chronically failing. Markets fail across the world. The logic before was that government fails. So market comes in to bail government out. And so we started government as focused on helping the private sector, or rather allowing the private sector to drive the economy. But the result has been that whereas we can point to some significant improvement in terms of growth sectors, for example, we talk about growth in telecom that started with the Obasanjo revolution. We talk about growth in the entertainment and art industry with all the support for Nollywood. We talk about some growth in agriculture in the Jonathan days and now. But essentially, these growths have not dealt with poverty because of articulation. Poverty agenda has not been part of the mainstream. I give an example, agriculture. The central bank is doing well in terms of providing this anchor borrowers fund and other interventions to help productivity in the agro area. But if you look at Southeast Asia, other countries that use agriculture, it's built around land reform. It's built around helping household farms more productive and therefore create economy, increase the income of rural people. But I think our own agro policy has not connected in a robust way with improvement in rural income. And until agro reform tell us towards land reform, tell us towards greater empowerment of rural folks and towards rural economy as it were, rather than commercial agriculture, we won't do with poverty. Again, we look at the area of manufacturing and the area of industrialization, which perhaps all governments have talked about. Power is a constraint. And we heard Dangote, the richest man, wisely say, look, Egypt got in 18 months 1,000 megawatts. In 18 years, we've not got new 1,000 megawatts from greenfield. And what's the problem? Policy implementation. And it comes back to this notion that, we are going to allow the private sector take all the risk, make the investment, and grow capacity in the power sector. Now, we need to retool that conception and say, look, government should play more role in socializing risk, make the financing, get the private sector to perhaps manage, but don't expect the private sector with the risky nature of our markets, where there is underpayment, under recovery, under settlement, where consumers, the quality of service is low, and therefore incentive to pay is very low, and therefore losses, customers is very high. If you expect the private sector, who are IPP developers, to be able to financially close their deal, build their plants, and connect to the grid in 2, 3, 4 years, then that's not realistic. So government should be the one who perhaps borrow massively, invest massively in new greenfield investment in power. Let it be that those power is available but not efficient, and then we will de-risk the market to help. So I think there's really short-term review of policies to do 3 things. 1, to attack poverty at the level of redistribution. We have to use the market tool, but govern the market in a way that profitability, profits, and revenue flows back to the poor. And secondly, you need to build infrastructure in a way that you don't rely on the markets. You rather use the market to raise financing for infrastructure. And thirdly, I think is, look, political economy. The outcome, a developmental state is based
please,
on...
can you hold on so that we take a commercial
If the economy is not autonomous, if it's connected to special interests, either ethnic or commercial, then the state has no autonomy to make the right policy and implement them fairly and rigorously. So in a sense, it's not only about economics, it's also about politics.
Hello, Sam.
About the people we get to the team, about the policy of government.
I get all the points you made, and I have a question for you, particularly on the power sector. But before we go back to that, this whole thing about appointments, some people are saying that there's no way the president, can make appointments without the National Assembly in place. And perhaps what we have had so far is the president waiting for the National Assembly to convene tomorrow. Do you think that that's a strong argument, particularly as many of these appointments will have to go before the National Assembly, particularly the Senate?
Okay, I think constitutionally, the first thing that happens is that the president would indicate the number of special assistants, aides, special advisors that he wants. He normally sends to the National Assembly the number, and they confirm. Now, let's look at what's happened in the states. The state governors resumed, those who were up for election, resumed with the president on May 29. And from Kaduna to Imo to Ondo to Ogun, across the country to Oyo, these governors sent lists for chief of staff, lists for secretary to government of the federation. These are not conformable positions under our law. They send lists also of special advisor. And by the way, they send lists to the existing National Assembly. As long as the National Assembly has not, like it expired on midnight yesterday by a fraction of time, as long as it has not expired, or the president has not proclaimed its end, as it did on June, I think, 11th, sorry, June 9th, I think. As long as that has not happened, the National Assembly is qualified by law to approve appointments for Mr. President, and that's the idea of staggering. So the idea is that the governance continues. If there were laws that the National Assembly made on the 8th of June, the President will sign those laws if he wants to sign them. So the argument about the National Assembly not being in place is not really convincing. Legally, nothing stops the President from making those appointments, even if he doesn't want to make the ones that are subject to confirmation. He could make those that are not confirmable. But he can still make both appointments, and the National Assembly will probably clear them. And if they don't clear them, don't forget that by rules now, all unfinished business of the National Assembly continue. Now, there are 2 points here as well. Even if the President indicates the appointment he has made, by saying, like what South African president did. The South African president issued a statement defining the direction of government and said these are the persons for what position. Now, there could be due process to follow after all. So the idea about early announcement is that it indicates clearly the direction the president is going to go. It tells us the quality of people who are going to execute these policies. I think many years ago, I've written to the former Senate President then, David Mark, and written to the President then, Jonathan. And I had argued that we should not be sending list of nominees without portfolio. Because everybody is technically qualified to be a minister or whatever, but not everybody is qualified to be a minister in some areas, or some people have special interests where they should be disqualified from positions. So it's also good to always say, look, A will be minister for this, B will be this, so that the public can now scrutinize and say, look, this guy's wife used to be so and so in this place. Does he have enough, is he conflict of interest free for policy direction in this sector? This guy used to be the sole contractor for this sector. Is he going to have the neutrality to drive government policy? These are the kind of conversations we have, and that helps when you have a sense of who will take this position. So that by the time the National Assembly sits there, their confirmation is also based on the public discourse, the discourse out there. They're not intelligence officers. They don't have profile of everybody. But these conversations could happen before these people are confirmed. So two arguments. One is that you necessarily don't have to have the new National Assembly coming before appointments. There are officers that could be appointed without confirmation, and there are also opportunity for you to get the old National Assembly, approve number of aides, and you return them. SAs are not confirmed, but you need an approval of how many aides you want. That has been the practice. And thirdly, I argue that even if you're going to await confirmation, it's good to have indication and say, look, this is my team, and then people start perhaps supporting with ideas and reaching out and perhaps also vetting, as the case might be. So nothing wrong. The president perhaps is taking his time. Maybe in a couple of days, we'll begin to see those names. But the point is, nothing illegal or unconstitutional about an earlier appointment before the new National Assembly takes place.
Well, I get your point, but you know, of course, the relationship between the Bukola Saraki-led Senate and the presidency. If you were President Buhari, will you send a list to, a Senate led by, former Senate President Bukola Saraki, considering the rift, the perpetual rift between that National Assembly and the presidency?
Interestingly, really, it's like the relationship between Naman, the Senate President, and OBJ. Personally, perhaps not good, but formally, there are a lot of linkages in that Senate and Executive. I did some work for them as well. Don't forget that in the later part of this National Assembly, they were doing approvals. They approved officers, the board for Northeast Development Corporation. They approved one officer they approved several boards. I think perhaps compensatorily, they were really approving everything the president said. So I would argue really that it seems to me that Bukola Saraki would have more incentive, perhaps, to approve president's list this time around than they did before. They were doing a lot of approval. So, and this year quarrel did not grind down, didn't grind work in significant areas of the economy. The National Assembly did work with the president well enough when there was need. I think perhaps the case of Mago, that itself originated from the presidency. Don't forget that the report came from the DSS. So people used the Mago and a few of those tangles to define the relationship between the executive and the legislative. They were not that problematic on a personal level, yes. On politics, yes. But I would argue that on legislative work, the last National Assembly provided significant support to executive as they could based on other variables, politics. But on this issue of list, approving 14 special advisors, 12, this National Assembly would have done that. I don't think they have any incentive. And what they did towards the end of the day, approving boards, approving appointments, showed that. And even the case of the CBN governor, that was too swift, in spite of some misbegotten petitions against him. They were swift in confirming him. So that's clearly, it destroys the assumption or the statement that, look, this Saraki committee, Senate would have kind of filibustered or basically, refused to approve president's application for aids or even a nomination, as the case might be.
Now, speaking of the CBN governor's approval as well, let's move back to the economic side and the economic outlook over the next 4 years. Now, last week on the show, sir, we had Dr. Mustapha Chike-Obi, and he stated to us that if the Nigerian economy is not growing at least 10% between now and 2025, then, quote unquote, we're pretty much doomed. Let's look at the President's National Economic Council and what we should be expecting from an economic council. Loads of arguments came up during his first administration that his economic council wasn't necessarily filled with the economists and the economic analysts that we should have seen. So what do we need to see going forward from a new economic council, especially in terms of our fiscal and monetary policies that can really reshape Nigeria over the next 4 years?
Well, I think I will agree with Mustafa on the fact that, yes, we're going at 2.01, but that kind of growth is thoroughly negligible. We need to get back to, which is difficult, going by the global economic constraints that we're seeing. Our economy is not that competitive as perhaps it was, and perhaps other economies in Africa are also, matching us or even overtaking us. So the prospect of a 6-digit growth, 7-digit growth we had, a couple of years in the past might not be that easy. But that's actually where we should be going. Like Ghana is posting higher growth, and of course, economists will argue that growth also depends on whether your economy is saturated. Where are the new frontiers for growth? We saw that frontier in Nollywood, in commercializing entertainment. We could get some from agriculture and so on, but we need to identify those new growth frontiers. And for me, I think infrastructure, in fact, insecurity could be an economy. We can put so much money, employ more police officers, employ more military. That kind of employment is, a war economy. You can create a war economy. You can create a war economy around insecurity, and that could lead to new sort of growth, especially with regards to employment and with regards to production. Then back to the issue about the Economic Council. I think the problem is that there's this debate between academic economists and perhaps what we call financial analysts, financial experts as to who should run the economy. I belong to the school that talk about the developmental state, and I think we need to pack the Economic Council with allied skills: academic economists, financial experts, social scientists, political economists, political scientists. Why is this so? We discovered that institutional economics tells us clearly now that what drives growth and development is institution. An institution is not formally defined. It includes norms, prescriptive norms. It includes organizing transitional norms, things that create, constrain, and enable performance. Therefore, economic council should have not just persons drawn from the banking sector or real economy, manufacturers, people like Dangote. You should have academic economy. You should also have sociologists, social scientists who bring a narrative, because it can give me the figure. This is X, this is how we are growing. But the narrative as what that growth means in terms of livelihood. Bill Gates spoke about our infrastructure plan and said, look, the deficiency is actually in the human capital side of it. We should have Minister of Education, Minister of Health, or people who are leading regulatory agencies around those sectors, health, education, as part of the economic team. Because you need reinforcement. You need self-reinforcing policy platform, so that when you are driving on banking sector, for example, fiscal policy, monetary policy around borrowing, around prudential easement, around even borrowing, borrowing to real sector, you have also political economists who will analyze what's the impact of these growth centers on well-being, on insecurity, because essentially the deficit is human capital. And because human capital is low, then productivity is low. And because productivity is low, the economic growth will stagnate. And that reinforces back to welfare and economic welfare of the poor. So I think we should have a team that's made up of persons who have both practical experience, those who have theoretical experience, because like Tony Blair said once, he said, look, conceptual clarity is critical to any implementation. Don't throw away theory. Good theory is like practice. It gives you a diagnosis of the problem that is much more robust. Those who study reform failure tell you that part of the problem is that reformers don't pay attention to context. And context means you have to do a holistic mapping of the problematic, the problem. Diagnostic tools are not going to be those of financial market leaders alone. It will be tools of social science as well. So I would argue that we should get back to development state, which is a state that's based on political economy. and not have a economic council that's made up of private sector captains whose lens is the lens of business profitability. Because, there's also a capture issue of, what special interest capture. Oftentimes, the problem with governance in Africa is the word autonomy. Autonomy in the literature is that a state is not held, is not working towards the interests of any particular sector. The state is autonomous in its decision. It makes policy for public interest and has the capacity to implement those policies, not to the benefit of either an ethno-religious group or even a commercial group. That is the prime requirement for a developmental state. State autonomy, capacity to make policy that is for strategic public interest and not be hijacked. I think to have everywhere filled up with people who say they're private sector captains and then a few people from the commercial sector is not good. Let's have an economic team made up of economists, academic, political economists, social scientists, as well as practical businessmen and women, so that in that, cross-section of ideas, you develop policies that pay attention to the different contexts in which you're going to implement those policies. That's what my advice would be.
A multidisciplinary approach to solving problems is always much better. And we can't leave economists to institutional economists alone, just as we cannot leave politics only to professional politicians. Thank you very much for joining us again this morning on The Morning Show. Thank you, Sam.